Cool. So, James, just talking off air around the big three and a little bit more about why they potentially may not be the big three. For anyone who's wondering what the big three are, it's typically the squat, bench, and deadlift. Talk to us about why potentially they may not be as big as often spoken about.
I think within the exercise world, so often we just look at movements that we did when we were potentially 16, 17, 18, and were good to rub our ego. And they said it felt fine back then, but as we get into our 30s, 40s, maybe 50s, our bodies aren't quite the same. And we've got to have a bit more of an appreciation of what's going on with their movements, rather than just, yeah, my mate deadlifted 100 kilos, 150 kilos, 200 kilos, whatever it may be. Oh, I want to try and beat that. Or when someone asks you in the gym, oh, how much do you bench? You want to be able to give them a figure. You want to be able to give them a number. But really, when it comes down to it, it's like, what are their movements? Yeah, they're used within strongman competition. But why are we going to the gym? We're going to the gym to improve generally how we look. And there's other deeper meanings, we could get into that. But the reason is we don't care about that number on the weight. Our egos think we do, but we don't. So if the end goal really is to improve aesthetically how we look, improve muscle tone, muscle tissue, whatever that may be, we want to then step back and think, okay, what's really going on with that movement? Rather than that bar just coming up and down the chest. What are we really trying to get from it? What are we really trying to work? And then when we start to break that down, we're like, maybe that's not the optimal movement. And that's the same thing when we come to a squat. For the Olympic lifter, who, when they squat in, their torso's up perfectly straight and that bar sits in nicely, and say they've got these femurs that are really, really small, they can sit into it perfectly and they feel fine and they get no pull through the back, or their knees feel fine. But 50, 60, 70% of the rest of the population, when they squat in, their knees either dive in, the bum sits back, they feel a little wobbly, they're not stable. And it's just, there's so much of a skill component to that we're not aware of, and we think it's just, yeah, you squat up and down and that's it. We think it's the best exercise to grow your legs, whereas when we start to break the bench press, the squat, the deadlift down, they're so complex. There's such a high skill component to them that people who can do them take for granted, and everyone else just doesn't appreciate. And the guys who can do them well, or girls, have probably been doing them in a way since they were a teenager, and they've learned them over the years and years and years, then gradually build them up. Whereas within the coaching industry, you see a huge amount of people who, because the coach could do the movement, they'll give it to their client, and the client hasn't got that same skill component. So I just think we don't appreciate, as a general term within the fitness industry, what goes into a movement. And when we really start looking, whether it's at them big three, they're not optimal for what generally we want as an outcome goal.
One of the things that I always say to people, especially with the squat, people love the idea of squatting in a sort of back squat variation. And whenever I tell someone I don't think you should squat, they'll try every single way of saying that they should be squatting. They'll send me every video possible. I'm like, dude, you just don't need to squat. And the squatting is the reason why your hips are hurting, your knees are hurting, your back's hurting. There's nothing wrong with the squat itself. It's just that your femurs are long. You haven't got the right structure for it, and it's probably not going to be the best thing because your goals are aesthetic, and it can be it's dropping that ego, isn't it? More than anything.
That's a huge thing. And we've all, I say we all, but in general, people have got this emotional attachment to whether it be the squat or whether it be the bench press, because maybe say it's something when they used to train when they're in a teenager, and then they fell out of it because work got busy, family got busy, and now they want to get back into training, and still all they know is what they trained when they were younger, and they've got this number in their head or certain things, and I enjoy squatting. Like, well, do you really? If we actually break it down, you do it and you get a little niggle in your knee, or do it in your back pulls. So yes, you say.
Do you want to dissect that then? Do you want to dissect that? Why dissect the squat, and as best as you can, obviously on an audio platform, but why potentially it's not the best exercise for growing your legs for everyone. If you're not that perfect squatter who can squat with a bar on their back, stay completely upright, and sit very nicely in the hole, and just looks aesthetic, if you're not that person, why is that the case? And what should you do instead?
Really, when it comes down to it, we need to think of a movement really in terms of the forces that are being applied to the body. And trying to, again, get that visual picture of whether it's that Olympic lifter who's doing a clean or something, he's going into that front squat position, whether it's trying to visualize how when a baby squats. My little boy's 16 months at the moment, and he squats and is absolutely perfect. Literally arse to grass, hamstrings touching calf, upright perfectly straight, or torso is perfectly upright. And that's because how they're built, how babies are built at that age. They've got sorry.
Dogs too.
Baby, sorry. Can you pause that? Yeah, so when we're looking at basically how a baby squats, there's a reason they can squat perfectly and we can't. Because at that age, they've got this long torso, they've got this head that proportionally is very big compared to the rest of the weight of their body. So their center of mass sits very high up. So when they squat in, they've got this perfectly upright torso. And in a sense, if we keep some of them proportions as we grow older and as we get into being an adult, then we potentially will still be able to squat well and be able to sit into the movement. So there's one thing is genetically, how are you built? What's the relative length of the floor to knee compared to the length of your knee to hip, compared to the length of your hip to your head? That plus the ability to get into a certain range of movements through your ankles, knees, hips, spine. And then plus the skill of doing the movement. Like when we break them things down, they'll determine in a sense your ability to perform the movement. And then the more you practice it, the more from a skill component you get better at it. But when we look at, well, the amount of time someone has to do to get good at it, that's probably going to be considerable. Whereas the amount of time that the general population clientele who go to the gym have got, 3, maybe 4 hours a week, outside of lockdown if they're going to the gym. But if they're going to the gym, they've probably got minimal time to really learn that skill. So when we think what they've got to give in terms of do we get good at it, one, is their body really built to do it? Probably not. Because if they were, they'd probably be in a sport or doing it, or would have picked it up early on, or just know they move into it well. And then we've got these other machines, whether it's leg press, whether it's hat squat, whether it's a Smith machine, that we can use to our massive advantage to sort of fit us into a certain movement. Because if we're trying to use the squat to grow our quads, we need to be able to sit into it and be in this perfectly upright position, rather than our bum fly massively back and our torso drop over. So if the end goal is to have nicer legs and grow your quads, then we've got to try and have an exercise where the load potentially is going through the legs, or going through the quads, rather than the load potentially going on the back. So I don't know if people can visualize that, but as I say, a lot of us don't squat like a baby. And if we do, then yeah, you might get a lot out of it if you know the skill. But again, even if you can get into the movement, are you going to be willing to learn that and sort of continue with it and keep practicing it, rather than really when we've got to think, well, how can I get a lot out of a minimal time? And it's easier to jump on a hat squat or a leg press or something where you're locked in, you're stable. There's less to juggle, there's less to go on. And really, like, as you know, there's a huge skill requirement still to get them movements right. Let alone the exponential kills come around to get a squat, a deadlift type movement right.
It's crazy. Like for years, I think for the first 5 years I was training, I think I must have tried squatting once a week, twice a week, 6 times a week. I tried the Smolov squat program, all these crazy things. And in the end, all I needed to do was to grow my quads was to not squat and just hack squat and leg press. It took me years of injuries and problems, in which I'm paying for now, to learn that I'm not built for squatting. But for others who may not have this, thing is, I was aware and I was still trying to battle my ego of doing it. That's the crazy thing. But
that's we've come through that, we've learned from that.
Yeah.
And we're trying to teach people from what we've learned the hard way, rather than them go through that same 10, even longer for me, 15 years of,
you're 6 foot, you're 6'7", aren't you?
Pardon?
You're 6'7", aren't you?
Yeah.
So I can't imagine what your squat's looking like.
Yes. Because I've got reasonable range, so I'd still get into it. But yeah, from a low perspective, predominantly, I'd be just going through my back and my hips.
Yeah. So someone listening, how can they identify if they're built to squat or not? What are some of the things they can pay attention to?
Their ability to stay upright as they're squatting into them. Movement. And do you sort of forward a little bit? Do you have to have your arms out in front of you to try and keep upright? Or do you find your bum sticks back a little bit? You can't really allow your knees to go forward because maybe a limited ankle movement. So if you've got a good ability to really keep quite bolt upright, then you're probably going to be able to squat, or potentially there is that ability, you might be able to get into that movement. And then it's trying it, say, with a load on your back, with a minimal load initially, to again see how does that change stuff, because it may do. As soon as we put a bar on the back compared to our arms out in front of us, that's going to change potentially how that squat looks. And it's a tough thing to do. And if it feels comfortable, then it probably looks better. But if for some reason it just doesn't seem comfortable, you feel like you're collapsing over a little bit, then yeah, it's probably just not best.
You say, so you said for the squat test, would you have your arms out in front of you, or would you not?
It depends on the individual. Like if someone has to put their arms out in front of them to keep upright, then basically what they've tried to do there, if they've tried to use the weight of their arms, that still might be 5-10 kilos, whatever it may be, to help keep their torso up. So in a sense, if they keep their arms crossed over their chest, they're going to collapse over a little bit more. So if someone's unsure of like, oh, it doesn't make no difference, hold a 5 kilo weight in your hand and hold your arms out straight. You'll be able to keep your torso upright more with a 5 kilo weight in your arms compared to your arms just across your chest.
Yeah.
Proportionally where your center of mass is, so you're going to keep your torso upright a little bit more.
Sorry, James, you just cut off there a little bit. You said off the 5 kilos out in front of you, and then it said proportion, but I didn't catch the bit in the middle.
Yeah, so if you have that 5 kilo weight in front of you, you'll be able to keep your torso upright a little bit more.
Okay.
But as soon as you drop that 5 kilo weight, bring your arms across the chest and try and squat again, you'll drop over slightly.
Yeah.
So even just by having your arms out in front of you, that is going to change proportionally, in a sense, how your body's made up. Even though we think the weight of their arms isn't that much, that still is going to affect things a little bit.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. Like if I squat, just a bodyweight squat with my arms out in front, it's really smooth and I'm upright. As soon as I put it by my sides or even just hands across the chest, I'm falling over.
Yes, yeah.
Which is probably why I asked you.
Yeah, yeah. So like proportionally, by having that weight in front, you've brought your center of mass slightly higher up. So it goes back to the higher up the center of mass, the more you're going to keep your torso upright. Like we spoke about in that baby example, their center of mass is pretty much their head. That weighs so much more than our head relatively compared to the rest of the weight of our upper body. So by having the arms out in front, proportionally, you've raised the center of mass up so you can keep your torso a little bit more upright.
Where does the split squats fit into all of this? You mentioned the hacks, leg press, and Smith machine. Something that a lot of the general population do well off typically are split squats. How do you find those are for most people, and what are some of the things to look out for here?
I think the key thing with a split squat, yeah, so with a split squat is realizing that as a coach, if we're going to prescribe that to a client, there's still a lot going on. Sometimes, yes, we might think they're going to be able to perform it better, but the range of movement we need, one through the front leg, but in some ways more importantly as well through the back leg, is large, and people don't account for that. The position that back knee is getting in as well, so people aren't really aware of that. So that's definitely something we've got to be aware of, and there is, that huge skill requirement for that as well. And I think a lot of coaches go in and do it bilaterally. They do it with both arms. They got dumbbells maybe in both hands, whereas probably we want to use one hand to try and help stabilize and balance, and maybe just have a load in one hand, because there is a huge skill requirement to that again as well, like the squat. But we don't want to assume that someone can just sit into that as well.
With the often you hear with people that they get exposed to different sentiments, and they may get said, machines remove sort of functionality and all these sorts of things, and that they want to stay functional, they want to stay natural with their movement. You and I both know that's not the case, but
yeah,
what is your sort of response to those sorts of claims?
The body and the muscles don't know what's going on. They don't know the difference, in a sense, between that squat and the hack squat. They know the sensations going on. They know the forces being applied to them. So unless we are training an elite athlete, there is a crossover. There is a crossover between what we do on the leg extension and what we get out of the hack squat. If you're going to do a squat, what we do on the leg extension and what we get out of the squat. If you're Usain Bolt and you're trying to improve, get your 100-meter sprint time, then things may change a little bit. But for everyone else, there's a massive crossover in terms of what we do on one movement that does come with us onto the next movement. So this argument that you've got to do free weights, you can't do machines, they're not functional. If you can strengthen the quads on leg extension, that's going to come with you onto the squat. There is a function there is no crossover there, let alone in day-to-day life. If you want to strengthen your core, strengthen your back, wherever it might be, because you've got lower back pain, if we isolate quads, hamstrings, glutes, lower back, whatever it may be on certain machines, that strength is going to come with you in day-to-day life. So I say the body doesn't know the difference. The body only knows what forces are being applied to it. Just knowing that like we can bring that strength, that coordination, that movement, that ability to contract from an isolated machine-based movement, get that nailed. And then if it's appropriate, come maybe into the more high skill required movements around free weights.
Yeah, well, I completely agree. And yeah, the body doesn't know, just like you said, the forces, it only really understands tension. Describe what tension, when people say the body only knows tension, what does that mean? And how does that relate to, say, muscle growth and hypertrophy overall?
I think even just taking a step back outside, just looking at what tension is, as coaches, we should understand what's going on sort of internally and externally within the movement. So internally, what's happening within the body. So what's happening around the joints, what's happening with the muscles, and externally, what's happening with the machine. And then do we know how them two come together? So when we're looking at tension, typically we might say within certain extremes of a movement, we feel a lot of tension. So say, for instance, take a dumbbell fly. We might feel a lot of tension in that stretch position. And because we feel that stretch on the outside of the chest, on the outside of the pec, we think it's working more. So we think we're getting more tension from that movement in the outer pec. And then we go and do a pec deck or a cable fly, and we feel that more in the inner pec. So we think there's more tension in the inner pec. Whereas that feeling isn't always the case. And knowing that a muscle just runs from one point to the next, and it's literally like an elastic band. If you pull on one end, that tension's being taken through to the other end. So we can never work that outer pec on the fly, on the dumbbell fly, or the inner pec on the cable fly. We're always working along that whole fiber of the muscle. And I know you've been ridiculously lean. If you look back when you were seriously lean, you saw the striations of the pec. If you look on any bodybuilder or anyone that's been insanely lean, you see where them striations are. And that tension from the load we're using will run along that whole fiber. So knowing that we can't really choose inner or outer, we can't choose upper or lower bicep, and then the tension goes along that whole bicep. But these are certain things that a lot of people may think, oh yeah, I can work my outer chest, I can work this inner upper chest. That's what I really want to have, that pop on my chest and get that inner upper chest. Like, no, it doesn't work like that.
So when people say that they're doing inclines for their upper chest, is there anything to that?
So there is something to that, but the difference in position is going to vary on everyone. And a lot of people really, when they think they're going on incline to work the upper chest, really they're just taking the lower chest out of it and keeping the tension more through the anterior delt.
Okay, so they're actually not really training the upper chest, they're training the delts.
Yeah, and you'll see that from an aesthetic point of view from a lot of guys who've got overdeveloped anterior delts and not a developed chest. Because they're moving into a position which is taking almost the chest efficiency out of the movement. And then the tension stays purely through the anterior delt. But with appropriate setup, with appropriate cueing, with awareness of someone's structure, so someone's rib cage size, with awareness of how someone's breathing, how someone's performing the movement, with someone's thought process, you can potentially get a bit more upper chest than lower chest. When you're looking at the muscle fibers, the tension will go along them. It won't, so we can then emphasize a bit of a higher up fiber than a lower down fiber, if that makes sense. So you get a bit more higher up on the chest, you can set certain positions up to get a bit more out of them than lower down the chest. But for me, in terms of programming with general population, I'm trying to find a way where we can get our most bang for our buck. So many people still will go in and do chest one day, back the next day, quads the next day if they're lucky, and then maybe arms to finish the week or whatever it may be. Whereas no, really, it's like for most people, how can we pretty much get all of that in one session, or maybe split it up into two?
Yeah.
So going back to my point is, how can we set up a chest exercise that gets every part of that chest, not just the upper chest? Whereas most people set up that chest exercise so they only get the lower, and that's why they've got this undeveloped upper chest. Well, that's why they've got the dominance through the anterior delt. So how can we try and make the program as efficient as possible to get the whole chest within one exercise? Is that possible? Potentially, if we've got the right kit and equipment and setup, or maybe 2 at max. But we don't need to be doing 3, 4, 5 different exercises for a chest and working upper, middle, lower, outer, inner, whatever it may be. Which is the way a lot of people go with it, because that's how they train when they're 15, 16, 17 or something. So they still think, oh yeah, I've got to do 5 exercises from a chest to hit that upper inner part.
So talk us through the setup for a press. Let's just say the most bang for your buck press. How would you want to set up accordingly?
The tough thing about that is it's going to depend on everyone. But it's probably
maybe walk us through things like, should you put your shoulders back and down? Should you be lifting your rib cage up? Should you be pressing all the way out? These sorts of things, like common sort of questions, cues. What sort of things can work for the average, most people on the average basis?
Yeah, so some common key cues that really can work for everyone is the ability to keep your chest up. If you can really almost like take a breath in, elevate your chest, make your sort of, so you've got this barrel sort of rib cage. Even if you haven't got that structurally, but you can try, in a sense, create that in that position, then that's going to help get you in a more stable position, get you in a better position. So your pecs are then more aligned to help with the movement and create the force of the movement. So that's really my number one key thing. And then once we've got that, it's being aware in a sense of how you're breathing as you go through the movement. Because if you get down to the bottom and then really like breathe out, you're going to collapse that rib cage, collapse that sternum angle, drop your pec down and lose all efficiency in a position where you're potentially relatively weak. Same thing at the top. Sometimes as you press, people like same thing, breathe out massively and lose that foundation. So the number one thing really as a generic call is holding a stable foundation. And we can do that by taking a good breath in and holding that. And then as we go through the exercise, maybe just doing a shallow breath through our nose. We're probably not going to get massively out of breath. We're probably not going to get our heart rate up to 140, 50, 60 doing a pushing movement. So we should be able to keep the breathing really reasonably shallow rather than full breaths in and out. So that would be my first thing. Second thing would probably be, say, the ability to, as you're doing the movement, think about the contraction, try and think about the squeeze, rather than just thinking about getting that hand up and down, getting that bar up and off your chest. Try and slow it down, get a pause in the bottom position. If you can, try and create a contraction from your chest in that position and then move. Literally think 3-4 seconds down, 1 second at the bottom, 3-4 seconds up, pause, reset if you need to, and then back in. Literally just them couple of simple things can completely change it. Another great thing that can work for some people as an internal sort of cue is, say, if you're on that bench press, try and push back into the bench. Don't try and push the bar up. If you're at home at the moment in lockdown doing, say, push-ups, try and push that floor away from you. Don't try and push yourself up, try and push the floor away. If you do that in a 3-4 second count as you're pushing up, you're going to get that more feel, that more tension that we spoke about.
How do you find the balance between being so focused on the squeeze and the tension and actually lifting some weight? Because some people can go the other way, whereby they're so focused on the internal, they're actually not lifting any load.
Yes, yeah.
And there's a squeezing air. So how do we find that balance?
For guys, you've got to overbring them back and get them to do less load and get their ego out of the way. And then for females, you just got to get more weight on the bar because they're not generally doing enough. And for anyone who has been lifting for a while, I'd say go through a 3 to 4 week phase where you do really slow everything down, where you really reset some markers in terms of what loads you're lifting, how you're lifting, how you perform stuff. And then from there, start to log everything and start to build everything back up. And then we do need to start to think of lift progression and sort of increasing that load, but trying to keep the parameters that you've already set in terms of, do I pause at the bottom of the movement and then press through? Do I pause at the top of the movement? Do I keep thinking about the contraction? rather than start to speed it up. Because I think there's two key things that we need to be aware of as we're trying to progress and as we're performing them. The ability to hold the position, so the skill to hold that position as we're trying to maybe increase the load, as we're trying to apply more intensity, and then the skill to control the motion. So does every rep look the same? Does that first rep look the same as the fifth rep, look the same as the 10th rep, or the 15th rep? So they're the two key things we've got to think about as we try and progress. Can we hold that position in the bench press? And then can we keep that control throughout the speed of the movement? If one of them breaks down, we need to step back, reset the markers, and then try and push on again. And it's that constant thing of put 2 steps forward, then maybe pull back a little bit. Couple of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And the more advanced you get, the more you can hone that skill. And then you can lock in the position, you lock in the control, nothing changes. Someone can push you to failure, push you past failure, and you're still holding a stable position. You're still braced in, you're still locked. You haven't pulled your bum off the seat on that bench press. That's still stayed there, but you've gone past that point of failure and you've done them 1, 2 force reps. The skill in that is insane. And 99% of people can't do that. They've just got to focus on hold the position, get the control. Once they got them 2 in place, then try and progress it and try and lift more and try and work on progressive overload.
Would you say if someone has any leak in that flow you just mentioned, the set ends, or is there potential to push past that? What is the sort of room for error, if any, at all?
It completely depends. If someone's on a leg extension, then if they move their torso position a little bit, or they lift their bum up a little bit, but they're still holding the position with their knees, yeah, I'll let that go. I'll let that slide maybe. But if someone was doing a squat and now they're moving their torso position and suddenly their bum shift back, we know that load then's gone through the lower back a bit more. Right, now you're done. Rack the weight, get out of there, rest, reset, go. So it completely depends, and it goes back to what we get from the movement. And in terms of on the other side of that, okay, we might get this benefit, but with that also comes a certain risk. And if we're not aware of this risk to benefit sort of ratio, so yes, there could be massive benefit from doing a squat, but there's also a huge risk. Where can we get a massive benefit from doing a hat squat or a leg extension with less risk? Yes, we can a lot of the time. So that's why I'll probably program them type of movements first. And like the leg extension is going to have less risk than the hat squat. because there's less going on. There's less joints moving, there's less movement, but there's still a huge control. There's still a huge body awareness to hold that position on leg extension that people, again, underestimate. So it completely depends on the movement as to how much, I say, I'll allow things to go a little bit in terms of that position control, in terms of the motion to control. So yeah, again, that tough one to answer in precise terms, but it depends.
Of course. So you said with the pressing, you got the chest up, and by chest up, you're quite specific in that terminology as opposed to pin your shoulders, or are you saying literally just go with the barrel chest, men and women, really stick the rib cage up, and then focus on maintaining that position and control and tension at all times? They're the key points.
Yes, and with chest up, that'll get us a certain positioning through the shoulders. But I don't like to give a generic cue of pin the shoulders back and down.
Yeah.
Because if we come to do, say, a dumbbell press, or even a dumbbell press on an incline bench, to warrant doing that, the scapula's got to move. To get them dumbbells to a point where they almost come together. You don't want to clang them together, but where they get to a point where they're an inch off each other. So basically the arms are straight above, or your hands are straight above your shoulders. To get that to a point on an incline bench, the scapula has to move. So the last thing we want to cue is teach, lock your scapula back and down. But if someone was doing a flat barbell bench press, so their arms, their hands don't come together as they go through the movement, on that movement, we might be able to say, yeah, hold your scapula back and down and keep a locked in stable position. And a lot of people will be able to do that. Some people won't. Some people would still go through that movement and have to allow that scapula to move. But a large amount of people will be able to. But knowing whenever we come higher on an incline, or two, whenever we finish the movement with the hands close together, within them two scenarios, we're always going to have to allow the scapula to move. So the scapula is going to have to move the most on an overhead dumbbell press, because we're on a high incline and the arms are coming, the hands are coming together. So the scapula is going to have to move on that. But the opposite is a decline barbell bench press. We could probably hold a locked in stable position through the scapula, and everything in between is going to vary. And everyone's going to vary in terms of the angle they can get to on that incline before the scapula has to move, or the degrees they can bring their hands together before the scapula has to move.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. So it's very, as always with these things, it depends on what you're doing.
Yeah. And that's why I think as exercise professionals, we've got to have that skill to, whether it's view that online of what a client's doing, or obviously view that face to face and knowing what's appropriate for them.
Yeah.
Rather than trying to give them a generic cue or a generic position that we've done for all our other clients, or that they've always done. We want to try and make sure it's individual to them. And same thing I haven't touched on within that bench press is the range of motion they go into. I know for years I thought I had to touch that barbell on my chest. I'm touching the barbell on my chest, but then so's that 5'4" guy who's got this big barrel rib cage. He's touching the barbell on the chest. And then now I step back and look at that and look at the distance my elbows are traveling behind my body compared to the distance that his elbows are traveling behind the body. And I've gone through twice the range, though from the external world, we've both done the same range of movement. So that's a huge thing as well. We've got to look at on like this press and movement is what range of movement is appropriate for your shoulder structure, your setup, rather than just a generic, you're doing the bench press, doing a dumbbell press, get a max stretch. Get that bar all the way down to the chest. Or the benefits of doing a dumbbell press is we can go further. We can go deeper than that. We can get even more stretch. So that's another key aspect in the sense that we hadn't touched on, that range of movement should be, again, individual to you.
I remember when I first got exposed to a cambered bar, the ones with the bend in the middle.
Yes.
And I thought, this is going to be great. Get an extra stretch on my chest. Did a 3-week cycle of it. I was doing 3-second pauses on each one at the bottom. And 3rd week in, tore my AC, like a grade 1 tear. And I thought, that's probably... Now looking back, I'm like, it's so obvious. It was waiting to happen.
Yeah.
Because I've got long arms off.
It's so obvious now we know it.
Yeah.
But like the place we were in 10 years ago, everyone's still there. And it's only such a small bubble that's not within the fitness industry, let alone within people who go to the gym.
Yeah.
So we think it's obvious, but it definitely isn't for the clients that come to us, and let alone everyone else who even doesn't come to us and who's training outside in the gym.
James, talk about the stretch, because there's often there's a question between, are you stretching the muscle or are you stretching the joint? And I think the chest is a really good example of that, because there's that perception that the lower you go with the dumbbell press, the bigger the stretch is. But what's actually stretching there, and how do you know the difference between your bottom range in a chest press and the fact that you're just moving your shoulder back?
Yeah. So in terms of, we don't ever want to try and stretch a joint, and especially it's got so important around the shoulder. So if you try and visualize a golf ball sitting on a tee, but chop the front and the back off that tee, can you get that visualization? That is literally the shoulder joint. So we've got the glenohumeral sitting in basically in the scapula there, sitting on the glenoid fossa, and that glenoid fossa is basically like a golf tee with the front and back cut off, and then we've got this golf ball, which is the head of the humerus, sat on there. So from a structural point of view, it's shocking. There's nothing there. So the last thing you want to do is try and stretch that and then potentially pull that out of position. And I'm sure, literally, like firsthand, that's why you've got some shoulder issues, because you've gone to a range where your joint has been stretched, in a sense, and it's not a stable joint, so it hasn't liked it. And now
just thinking of that, the shoulder injury that I've been dealing with now, this is like something which has been building for 5-6 years, but I've been taping it up by just doing a floor press. But the reality is, I couldn't do a normal press because I damaged it from before.
Yes.
And just because I was the guy who used to almost like brag about how much range of motion I could do, like how deep I can go, and like the dips and everything. I used to go so deep because I've got quite good flexibility, but there's difference between flexibility that you want to actually load and flexibility that potentially you don't. For my case anyway.
Yeah, definitely. So going back to, in a sense, your original point, a really, really simple thing is sitting there in a chair, trying to imagine you're doing a bench press. So imagine you get into the bottom of that dumbbell press, and what range can you actively get to? So what range can you use your muscles around your scapula, your rear delts and stuff to pull you into? And that's a good thing, that if you can get to that range and then you can still almost feel a contraction in your chest as you push out, or even without load, you can squeeze your chest and use that squeeze of your chest to then move your arms. That would be fine to work to that range. But if that bar, if that dumbbell is taking you past a point where you can actively get to, then you've gone too far. Even if it feels nice, I feel a nice stretch in this position. No, if you can't directly use the muscles on the opposite side, so the things around the back to pull you there, then you've taken it too far, and there's no point trying to get that stretch or that sensation or that feeling that you get.
What if you're at the point where you can't quite gauge this? Because a lot of, especially general population, the idea of trying to understand if your rear delts are pulling you back in a chest press is quite foreign, or the ability to flex your chest at the bottom of bench press might take a lot of time. How can you understand what this range is from a sort of objective assessment?
A very good generic cue to use on the press is you have to have someone look at you from the outside, but trying to make sure the bottom line of your tricep doesn't go basically below the line of the bench. So that internal structure that I talked about with the shoulder joint, so where that golf ball and that tee, that means that's going to sit in an ideal place. So basically what we're trying to do is take the humerus, so take the upper arm and in line so it's in plane with the scapula, and that's going to keep that joint in a nice place. And if we go back and watch that guy who does the powerlifting, that short guy who's got a thick barreled rib cage, that's the range of movement he'll go to, but the bar will touch his chest. So his tricep won't go below the line of the bench. But if I go and get that barbell to touch my chest, my tricep and my elbow are way, way below that line of the bench. I'm sure they would be with yourself. So that's a great generic cue to use, to have someone look at you from the outside and think, the line of your tricep, does that sit in line with your back? If that does, then yeah, hold it there, pause, and then gradually push out.
Would you say that's the same across all body part training? So no matter what you're training, using not that exact cue, but the idea of finding that active range can be applied across the board? Are there certain areas which are more obvious than others?
Yes, yeah, 100%. Yeah. And like, if you can get there without load, then you're pretty much going to be safe when you have load in there. There is going to be some exceptions, and as you add load, things are going to change a little bit. I know, say with yourself and your shoulder, say for instance, you might have to change the load or change the range as you progress the load and do stuff. But as a general term, that's a good one to use, whether that's around your hip and you're on a leg press. And try and bring your knee to your chest. And if you can get that into a certain range, then just stay with that range throughout the movement. Then as you get more skilled, you can maybe try and take it a little bit further and see if you can get more from it. But yeah, using without, or doing a movement without load, and then seeing how far you can get and just using that to do the movement.
What do you define as a beginner, intermediate, and advanced trainee?
Honestly, pretty much everyone's a beginner.
Yeah.
Even if you've been lifting for 10 years, because really you've only been lifting for a year and then you've repeated that same thing 10 years later. Like, the majority of people will learn something when they get into the gym, and that won't change for 5, 10, 15 years. And some will respond positively and they'll get great physiques, and some won't respond. But just because they respond positively doesn't mean they're advanced. Just because they're a high-level bodybuilder, high-level physique athlete, high-level personal trainer, does not mean they're advanced in terms of understanding actually what's going on with their body. And just because they've got away with a certain movement now or training a certain way, doesn't mean that 5 years down the line, they're still going to get away with it. I know for myself, there were certain things that I've got injury-wise now that were there in the background that I just wasn't aware of 10 years ago. And there wasn't any pain there, but I was still squatting. But now when I look back and see certain things from old video footage that was just around, and when I started squatting, things that were going on with my knees, things that were going on with my back, I was like, they would continue leading to why, say, some of my body's messed up now. And I've really got to work around stuff. But it's not until you're broken do you have that appreciation for the potential damage with intensity exercise can do. If you're not training hard, it's fine. Not a problem.
Yeah.
Apply intensity, bring a personal trainer into the picture and apply intensity to something. And then it can be a different story. And if you haven't got the joint tolerance, then things are going to break down.
Do you think when people break down on a regular basis with their joints now, especially when they get exposed to proper programming and exercise execution, do you think it's suddenly because of awareness and also your body almost having the last sort of straw, and you just sort of blown it out? Because I find that often that where people have spent years and years getting away with it with bad habits, and then suddenly when they implement good ones, that's when all the things start coming up.
Yeah. There's definitely that awareness thing, but it's
Yeah,
just, I think the longer in the game,
yeah,
the more likely things are going to flare up. Just because it doesn't hurt now doesn't mean that you're not doing damage on the inside.
mm,
Yeah, I think that's key. Like for me, it's about how can I do this in 10 years? How can I do this in 15, 20 years and still be in shape? How can I train my son in 20 years' time? So anything I do now is to make sure that I don't continue trying to break down. And if things are already niggling, things are already there, then it doesn't mean they're going to get worse if we suddenly appreciate what's going on with the movement. And if we start slowing things down, if we start having more awareness, we start really thinking about the exercise we're applying rather than just the ones we've done for years.
What are some of the biggest things that you've implemented in the last couple of years that have made the biggest difference to your training?
Leaving my ego at the door. A key thing, which I'm not gonna lie, probably took 15 years to do. Because for us guys, we still want to do that bench press, we still want to do the squat, and that stayed with me for a long time. Even when I knew it wasn't optimal, still kept going back to it, still kept doing it. So that was like the number one biggest thing. And I think the second thing outside of that is, don't think that isolation movements haven't got a place or can't still get a result. Which so often we're drummed into is that we've got to do that squat, bench press, deadlift, or even that hack squat, that chest machine, that pull down. Whereas for a huge amount of people, it could be leg extension, hamstring curl, isolation movements that we can get a lot out of. So sometimes just getting the most out of a machine is we don't realize how much we can really get from that, rather than trying to have to do these big fancy movements.
It's definitely something I struggle to get my head around. Like if this is programming isolation movements, I just feel like I'm not even trained.
I know. Yeah, but that fatigue that you used to feel in is more of a systemic full body nervous system fatigue rather than purely a muscular fatigue. So it's that sensation that we're used to get from training. We've got to sometimes try and change that and not get attached to a certain sensation, because that's not a directly fatigue of that muscle. That's a fatigue of the full body that we get from them bigger compound movements. It's a fatigue of the nervous system that we get from them movements. Whereas really, can we fatigue that muscle even more on the leg extension? 100% yes. We can take that to absolute failure at a certain point when someone's got the skill to do it. But very, very rarely could we get that same level of fatigue in the quads on the squat. But the whole body might be knackered, bollocksed.
So I think you cut off there. Said the whole body might be bollocks.
Yeah, so the whole body might be fatigued, but on that squat example, it's very, very unlikely that you're going to get that same level of fatigue as what we got or what you could get on a leg extension when you're in that stable position. So once you start getting your head around a different sensation, you can reach a higher level of fatigue, potentially working the isolation movements, than you could on then some of them big compound, high skill required movements.
One thing you talk about a lot of is matching strength and resistance profiles. Obviously, this is a massive topic in itself, but if you talk on a very high level, what does this mean, and how can this be implemented into your day-to-day training?
It's very simply, it's just trying to match where we're strong with having a bit heavier load and where we're weaker, having a little bit lighter load. It really is that simple. We can look at the in-depths of it and really delve into it to try and create as most efficient challenge as possible. But from an application point of view, say, take that bench press. We can lift less load in the bottom of the bench press than we can at the top. because there's stuff going on structurally and some other things that we don't necessarily need to get into. But at the top of the bench press, we may be able to deal with 100 kilos, but at the bottom of the bench press, we can only deal with 80. So what do we put on the bar? We put 80 on the bar. So we can get it off the bottom and then we can push through to the top. But if we could set up a movement that had 100 kilos at the top and 80 kilos at the bottom throughout a pressing range, we'd get more out of it, we'd get more efficient challenge. And this is only important for two types of people in a sense: the complete beginner or rehab client, or the extremely advanced. Everyone in the middle, just have that 80 kilos on the bar and that'll be enough for them. They don't need to try and make that movement that heavier as they get into a strong position. They're going to reach a level of fatigue that's fine with just having an even weight on the bar throughout the whole range. But once you start to get experienced, then having it heavier where you're stronger and lighter where you're weaker can help from a joint health point of view, but can massively help from a muscular fatigue point of view as well. And then on the flip side as well, I'm sure potentially maybe years experience around your shoulder, there'll be certain positions you get into where you're so weak, any load and you can't get out of it. Whereas there'll be other positions or other ranges where, oh, I'm actually okay here. If you had an appropriate setup where it got so much lighter in them weaker compromised positions, they got heavier in that mid position maybe, and then maybe lighter again at a different part of the range, then you could start to develop strength quicker and not have a load in that weight, or have a load through a part of the range where the joint was potentially compromised. So it works well with extreme rehab or extreme experience, but honestly, everyone in the middle don't need to worry about it too much, but it's just one of the hype things in the industry at the moment. And the awareness of what's going on with a movement is so much more important. So that control, the position and motion and stuff that I spoke about, that's more important, but that's not as sexy.
No.
Look at it. So you don't have different companies bragging about how they load machines in different ways, and you can't attach funky bands to things when you're worrying about that. So it doesn't sell as much.
Well, yeah, everyone wants to add bands and chains, but no one wants to do a proper movement normally.
Yeah.
So James, why do you still train?
Why do I still train?
Yeah.
Well, when it comes down to it, if we don't use it, we lose it. So I still aesthetically want to be a certain shape, want to be able to do certain things. But more importantly as well, for a moment, it's a release.
Yeah.
It frees my mind. And I think for me as well, it's the thing that carries over to so many other areas of my life. It's the first area where I was really disciplined with. Playing a high level of sport, I had real focus and discipline around training, not just weight size stuff, things that I was doing within a sort of basketball career that I tried to pursue. And it was real disciplined. And then that discipline turned into the weights room. And then from there, that discipline turned into stuff within my business. So I think we think of weight just as this, or lifting weights as this superficial thing, where, as I know you're aware, it's got massive benefit outside of the gym. And if we tone or really focus on our ability to internally focus when we're in the gym, that internal focus then we can use in other areas of our life, and our body awareness and stuff like that is a massive, massive crossover. So for me, it's almost like training in a sense, is like a meditative practice where I've got this massive internal focus. And yeah, it's thinking about the contraction of the muscle and staying in the moment, but it's that ability to challenge the mind and focus on one thing, rather than let it wander and think, oh, I've got to do this check-in, oh, I've got to answer this email. Where so many people, when they're training, and their brains going all over the place. So yes, it's to keep me physically in shape. Yes, it's to keep up with my son. But as well, it's to keep my brain in check and keep me focused and keep me driven.
Totally aligned with that. One thing I talk about a lot is entering into that state, that meditative state when you're training, and going into that place when you're doing something really intense. What do you like to talk us through your build up into that when you've got a really big set? You know, the ones where you need to be so dialed in, and any leakage is going to cause a problem.
Yes.
Talk us through the setup into that, because I think that's one of the biggest factors that most general population are missing, and that I love when people find that, because that's when people ask you, why do you still train? It's like, I just train. I just train because there's that feeling. Talk us through your personal setup to that on a few lifts, if you've got any sort of personal.
Honestly, like, I don't get that. Sorry, the dog barking in the background again. Honestly, I don't have to find that same internal drive, because I'm not able to. Sorry, mate. So just reminders of what you.
Oh yeah. So,
yeah. Honestly, for me these days, I've had to change, in a sense, my thought process going into training, because for years I was attached to certain movements where I had to get so hyped up for. If anyone knows what like a rack pull is, basically a short deadlift movement. I stopped doing deadlift, 5-6 years ago, but then I was doing a short range movement, and that kept leading to little niggles and injuries. Same thing with the hack squat, moves like that, where I get so sort of hyped up and focused, and it kept leading to these niggles that I had to pull away from them. So I don't need to get as dialed up, because the movements I'll go to failure on would be like the leg extension. For my back and third would be ones where I'm locked in and stable on a machine, which I've been doing it for so long now, I can reach a high level of fatigue without needing to get that hype in the same way.
so
But I
maybe the
fully
hype
understand
is
what
the
you mean,
wrong
that most
hype
people.
is the wrong word. I think more internal focus. So you're so connected to the muscle. That's what I mean.
Yeah. And I think like that's the thing that people underestimate the skill of.
Yeah.
But once you've been doing something for so long, and it's remembering that I've been doing this for over 20 years now, shows me age. And yes, 10, 15 of them years weren't, like I say, optimal, but I still had an ability to contract muscle. I still, to an extent, knew what I was doing. I just sort of tear it apart now a little bit when I look at it. But yeah, that skill to really hone in and contract the muscle and get the most from the movement is underestimated, and people's minds are all over the place, and they don't really focus as much, because they don't realize what they can get out of the movement until it's something they stick with and keep building. And then you keep trying to egg them on, or get that bit more out of them, or keep them in the zone, because you see their mind wandering. They get to the top of that hack squat and you see them relaxing, and it's like having words with them, like, you've got to get back in the moment. Like you can see they're pulling away from pain, whereas that's what everyone wants to do. They don't want to experience that pain. Whereas we've got to have that sort of twisted mindset, in a sense.
Yeah.
We've got to love that pain, and as soon as that starts to go, oh, I'm getting weak. No, I don't mean physically, I mean mentally I'm getting weak. I've got to get back into there. So we've got to have this twisted mindset where we want to experience this pain, because in some odd way we sort of like it. And where most people, when they're not used to that sensation, they keep pulling away from it. They keep trying to find the easiest way to do stuff, rather than having that ability and that mindset to focus and go back in and get deep back into that hack squat, and then drive out of it, and then don't relax at the top, get straight back down and keeping that tension on.
If you approach it like a skill versus training, could that be the difference?
100%. 100%. We appreciate the skill within sport. We appreciate the skill, but within lifting, no one appreciates the skill requirement for that.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the best ways to approach it, really. So James, you're doing a lot of education out there, especially on the topic of mechanics and exercise selection and how to go through the motions. How can people find out more about yourself, some of the camps you're running, and some of the education that you're putting out there?
So myself and another couple of guys, we've got a subscription website, the Muscle Mentors. I say we've got loads of stuff based around exercise mechanics, but even based around other sort of topics around sleep, how to build tissue, hypertrophy, female health. That's the musclementors.co.uk. And then you can find myself on Instagram. It's James_the Muscle Mentors. And there's loads of stuff around training. If you'd like to have an understanding of what's going on, and I try and put it at a level which has got quick tips for people to take away, rather than sort of just go over people's heads on there. So a lot of the stuff you'll see on social media is applicable stuff that people can run with. And at the moment, loads of little things that people can train at home with, rather than giving people stuff to do at the gym that's not applicable. But always try and make sure it's some quick tips they can take away with.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing all your knowledge, James. Appreciate it.
Right, it's a pleasure. Thank you.